In late May 1718, a vessel commanded by Edward Teach approached the entry to Charleston Harbor in the province of Carolina. Teach had gained long experience using the coastal passages that connected mainland ports with islands to the south and east. As he reached the narrow approach used by ships entering or leaving the harbor, he positioned his vessel so that no ship could pass. For nearly a week, all movement stopped. Captains arriving at the port knew Teach by his nickname, a name feared across the Atlantic, Blackbeard. They would later explain there was no safe way to avoid the pirate ship and Teach's men. They boarded each vessel, seized valuables, and held several passengers hostage, compelling officials inside the town to respond. But the demand he made this time was unusual. He did not ask for coin or cargo. Instead, he called for a chest containing medical supplies, kept by physicians in Charleston. Several members of his crew were ill, and the continual effort required aboard a vessel meant that untreated sickness could halt his voyages. Charleston had no significant naval defense, and after several days of negotiation, the supplies were delivered to the beach. Only then did Teach release the detainees and allow ships to resume their movement through the harbor. News of this blockade reached London, in letters that emphasized its effect on trade. The incident demonstrated that a single pirate crew, using knowledge of predictable routes and taking advantage of weak protection, could interrupt commerce at a major mainland port. It also revealed how the early 18th century presented conditions that allowed small crews to exert influence far beyond what colonial powers were prepared to confront. To understand why such an event could occur, it is necessary to place it within the wider circumstances of the decade that followed the War of the Spanish Succession. Hello and welcome to Sleep with History. I'm still trying to get this channel off the ground, so any like, comment or subscribe would be really helpful. Or if you fancy it, join me on Patreon for just £3 a month. Thanks very much. That conflict, which ended in 1713, had employed many thousands of sailors across European navies and privateering ventures. When peace arrived, naval payrolls were reduced rapidly. England alone discharged several thousand sailors in a short period of time. Privateering commissions expired, leaving men who had earned reliable wartime income without work. Petitions submitted in ports such as Portsmouth, Plymouth and London showed that many sailors waited months for wages owed from earlier voyages. The sums listed in some cases equaled several months of a labourer's earnings. With few options for relief, many sailors sought alternative employment, but merchant shipping could not absorb this sudden surplus of labour, and wages for common sailors on merchant vessels often fell below £2 per month in the years immediately after the conflict. Legal employment therefore offered far less income than wartime service, and for sailors accustomed to pay that rose with each voyage during the conflict, the reduction created pressure that encouraged some to seek work elsewhere. Although piracy offered no legal protection, it provided a share-based system that ensured each participant received an equal portion of captured goods, with an additional amount allocated for extra skills or workplace injury. This stood in contrast to delayed wages and uneven treatment common on naval and merchant vessels. At the same time, the Atlantic economy expanded at a pace that made the region attractive to pirates. Barbados and Jamaica shipped sugar valued in the hundreds of thousands of pounds each year. Rice exports from the province of Carolina doubled within a short period, and tobacco continued to move in large quantities from the Chesapeake region, while timber from the mainland supplied shipyards in Europe. These goods travelled along routes familiar to all experienced sailors. These sailors turned pirates knew when the vessels sailed, how heavily they were laden, and how little defensive equipment many carried. Seasonal sailing patterns added predictability. Atlantic winds followed reliable cycles in most months, guiding ships through passages such as the Windward between Cuba and Hispaniola, the approach near the Bahama bank, and the routes north of the Florida Peninsula. Captains often departed at similar times each year to take advantage of favourable conditions, and pirates used this rhythm to their advantage. Anchoring near a known channel at the right moment ensured regular encounters with merchant vessels. This reduced the need for long pursuit, lowering the risk of damaging their own vessels while attempting to seize cargo. And the naval protections offered to these ships did not expand in proportion to trade. After the conflict, England reduced the size of its fleet to limit expenditure. Colonial governments often had access to only 1 or 2 patrol vessels, and sometimes none at all. Letters from Jamaica, Bermuda, and the mainland colonies reveal repeated concerns that they lacked the capacity to protect cargo moving through their waters. Requests for additional vessels frequently went unanswered for months due to long communication times. Piracy grew because the time between incident and response often exceeded the time needed for pirates to disappear into quieter waters. The geography of the area reinforced these conditions. Across the region lay numerous small islands, keys and inlets with little or no permanent population. Many offered water, shelter and space to repair hulls. Uninhabited locations near the Bahama bank allowed crews to clean planks, replace spars, and remove marine growth from ships. Because these places had no regular oversight, pirates used them without fear of immediate discovery. Their proximity to major routes allowed them to remain close to the movement of valuable cargo without travelling great distances. The economic conditions of the time played a role as well. Labourers in several colonies experienced a regular food supply due to poor harvests or limited imports. And for many, the share-based pay used by pirate crews offered greater financial security than the low wages available in colonial towns. Articles signed aboard pirate vessels provided clear compensation terms. A man who lost the use of a limb received an agreed number of shares from the next captured vessel. Such provisions offered security that many legal employers could not match, making piracy a stable source of income despite its risks. It was within this setting that several figures became prominent. Benjamin Hornigold gained early influence due to his skill in handling small vessels and familiarity with the shallow waters surrounding many islands in the Bahamas. His decision to avoid attacking English ships gave him a reputation for a form of consistency that some sailors valued. Men seeking guidance during years of uncertainty often viewed him as a capable figure with long maritime experience. Charles Vane represented a different approach. He rejected any contact with colonial officials and took vessels wherever he believed an opportunity existed. Reports from Bermuda, Jamaica, and nearby islands linked him with theft against merchant vessels travelling between these ports. His rapid movement between anchorages allowed him to evade detection for extended periods. Men who valued autonomy joined him, even when his decisions increased the risk of confrontation. John Rackham, known by the name Calico Jack, gained command after dissatisfaction with Vane's judgment. His ability to maintain calm relations aboard his vessel and to form temporary alliances made him a familiar figure in several anchorages. These individuals represented only part of the wider maritime world shaped by circumstance of the early 18th century. They did not form a unified group. Their interactions were irregular, taking place in damaged harbours, temporary camps near inlets, and uninhabited keys used for water or repair. Loyalties shifted according to the prospects each captain offered, the condition of a vessel, or the recent outcome of a theft. Men moved between crews when they believed another captain offered better chances of income or safety. What connected these figures was not a shared planning, but the combination of economic pressure, limited protection along major routes, and predictable movement of valuable cargo. These developments explain how New Providence became a focal point for piracy. The island lay near several important routes linking Havana, mainland colonies and islands to the north and east. Its main inlet provided calm anchorage and allowed vessels to enter or leave quickly. Damage from earlier conflict left the settlement without an effective defense. Nassau held only a small population of fishermen, farmers and families living in partially ruined dwellings. Wells supplied water in moderate quantity, and timber from abandoned buildings offered material for small repairs. There were few officials and little administrative capacity. These conditions made the island attractive to pirate crews. Vessels could anchor without reporting their arrival. Pirates divided stolen goods on shore, exchanged information about patrols, and repaired equipment using locally available materials. Because the island stood near to the approaches to major routes, crews could observe traffic with relative ease. Letters sent back to England often mentioned sightings of vessels linked with piracy near New Providence shortly before reports of theft along major lanes. Several incidents from these years illustrated the pattern clearly. Governors and merchants did not write about piracy in general terms. They recorded specific losses, naming ships, dates, and locations, in the hope that officials in London would recognize the scale of disruption. One report from the mainland concerned a brigantine carrying rice from the province of Carolina towards market in the Caribbean. Near the approaches to the Bahamas, a small sloop appeared from the direction of the islands and closed the distance quickly. The brigantine carried only a few light guns, and its crew had little training for combat. Pirates boarded, forced the captain below decks, and removed coin, navigational instruments, and trade goods in portable form. After several hours, they released the vessel, having taken what they could carry. When the brigantine finally reached port, the captain reported that the pirates had approached from waters near New Providence and departed along lanes leading back towards the island. A similar pattern appeared in a case reported from Jamaica. A ship carrying sugar and rum left the island in convoy with another vessel bound for the same region. As the two passed near the channels north of Cuba, a fast sloop armed with several carriage guns emerged from behind a quay and fired warning shots. The captains recognized they could not outrun the attackers without risking significant damage. Pirates boarded one ship at a time, focusing first on the slower of the two. They seized cash, small casks of rum, and items such as tools, clothing, and spare rigging. The second vessel watched the theft at a distance, unable to intervene. Both ships later reported that the pirate sloop had been seen previously near New Providence, where it had anchored briefly before moving into the main channel. Correspondents from Bermuda recorded another incident involving a vessel trading between the island and the mainland colonies. The ship carried mixed cargo: flour, dried fish, and manufactured goods destined for small ports along the coast. Near the edge of the Bahama bank, it encountered a two-masted vessel flying no recognized flag. The approaching ship fired a blank charge, and the captain of the merchant vessel, aware of recent cases of piracy, chose not to resist. Pirates came aboard, inspected the cargo, and selected items that could be sold quickly at markets: cloth, tools, and barrels of provisions. They also took the ship's compass and quadrant, making further navigation difficult. In his later report, the captain noted that he had seen a vessel of similar size and rig anchored near New Providence days before the attack. Other cases involved more direct violence. A letter from a governor in the Leeward Islands described how a small coastal trader had been taken near shallow passages to the east of the Bahamas. The pirates, frustrated by the low value of cargo, beat several crew members and threatened to destroy the vessel entirely. In the end, they took what they could and left the trader to limp towards the nearest port with damaged rigging and injured men. Testimony from the survivors mentioned that the attackers spoke of having recently watered their vessel at quays close to New Providence, naming the island as a place where they could obtain supplies without interference. Even when theft occurred far from the Bahamas, links to the island appeared in official papers. Captains seized near the coast of what is now Florida, or along routes leading towards Havana, reported that their attackers had mentioned New Providence as a place to sell stolen goods, recruit new hands, or repair damage. These remarks did not prove that every act of piracy began there, but they convinced governors that the island formed part of a wider chain that sustained such activity. Taken together, these incidents showed a consistent pattern. Vessels passed through or near waters watched by pirates who had used New Providence as an anchorage. Shortly afterward, reports of theft reached colonial offices, often accompanied by statements that the attacking ships had been sighted near the island in the days or weeks before the encounter. For officials trying to explain repeated losses, New Providence appeared less as an isolated settlement and more as a convenient point within a larger system of piracy that touched multiple colonies. By around the middle of the second decade of the century, New Providence's reputation was cemented, but before these incidents became frequent in colonial correspondence, observers had already noted that the unregulated groups active in the region relied on systems of leadership that differed from those found on naval and merchant vessels. These systems developed out of experience rather than formal instruction. Men who had served during wartime carried knowledge of how discipline had been maintained aboard official vessels and understood the limits of such methods once legal authority fell away. When they entered piracy, they adapted these methods to conditions in which formal ranks held no automatic weight. Command aboard a pirate vessel depended on agreement rather than imposed hierarchy. Captains acted as navigators and figures responsible for handling the ship during difficult weather or encounters at sea. Yet their authority depended on the confidence of the crew. If men believed that a captain showed poor judgment, failed to secure opportunities for income, or created unnecessary danger, they could withdraw support. In such cases, a crew often appointed another man whose experience they trusted. Surviving examinations, taken after capture, include several descriptions of such changes, noting that these decisions occurred in calm conditions, often when a vessel anchored near a quay or inlet. The process reflected a practical need. Crews could not rely on fixed ranks if those ranks undermined the chances of survival or success during voyages. Alongside the captain, another figure held particular influence. This man, commonly referred to as the quartermaster in legal accounts, served as an intermediary between the captain and the rest of the crew. He oversaw the division of stolen goods, resolved disputes, and managed the allocation of provisions during long voyages. Because pirates depended on cooperation rather than coercion, the presence of such a figure reduced the likelihood of conflict. When disagreements arose, either over the handling of captured cargo or decisions about future movement, the quartermaster presented concerns to the captain and conveyed decisions back to the crew. This arrangement aimed to prevent the concentration of authority in one individual and gave the men a sense that their interests would be considered during daily operations. These leadership systems shaped how voyages unfolded. Daily work involved maintaining the vessel, adjusting sails, repairing minor damage, and preparing for encounters with other ships. Men rotated through these roles according to skill. Those with knowledge of navigation assisted with handling charts and instruments. Those experienced in repairing rigging carried out work when conditions allowed. Because shares were allocated equally, except in cases involving specific skill or injury, each man had reason to contribute to tasks necessary for the vessel's condition. Depositions from several captured pirates described how decisions about when to repair hulls or seek water were made collectively, with the captain and quartermaster presenting options and the crew giving input based on practical concerns. Handling captured vessels followed a similar pattern. After securing a ship, the crew examined the cargo and selected items that could be sold quickly. Witnesses often reported that this process occurred with little confusion, guided by prior agreement rather than spontaneous action. Men understood how shares would be distributed once the goods were divided. Items with no immediate use were usually left behind, and captured captains were released after providing information about recent movements along major routes. These arrangements ensured that piracy could function with limited conflict despite the absence of formal rule. They did not eliminate disagreement, but they provided outlets for resolving it. A captain who lost the support of his men could be removed, yet the overall system rarely collapsed, because responsibility was shared between figures whose roles were understood by all aboard. This blend of experience, negotiation, and practical necessity allowed pirate vessels to operate with a degree of cohesion that surprised many colonial officials, who viewed them only as unregulated groups acting without order. New Providence did not function as a structured community, but as a settlement shaped by the moment, limited administration, strategic position, and regular use by passing crews. As piracy expanded, officials in neighboring colonies expressed concern that without intervention, the island would continue to influence the movement of cargo across the region. These concerns led to the appointment of Woodes Rogers as governor of the Bahamas. His arrival in 1718 would begin a new phase in the history of New Providence, one that would alter the conditions that had allowed piracy to take hold and change the island's role within the Atlantic world. When Woodes Rogers accepted the appointment as governor of the Bahamas in 1717, he stepped into a role shaped by years of concern from colonial officials about the consequences of piracy. Numerous reports sent to London during the previous decade described repeated theft, delays in cargo reaching Europe, and pressure on merchants who depended on predictable movement along the Atlantic routes. Rogers' selection reflected a belief in London that the situation required both familiarity with maritime conditions and the ability to rebuild a neglected settlement. His earlier privateering voyages had taken him across the Pacific and through waters controlled by European rivals. He had managed crews under difficult conditions and gained knowledge of the economic demands placed on sailors when secure employment disappeared after the war. These qualities made him a suitable figure for a region where uncertainty had shaped daily life for many years. The government's instruction to Rogers combined two aims. He was to offer a royal pardon to any pirate willing to abandon theft at sea and return to lawful activity, and he was to take measures against those who rejected this protection. The offer applied to all acts of piracy committed before a fixed date and promised legal security to those who accepted. Similar proclamations had been issued in earlier years, but none had been supported by a governor sent directly to enforce them. The hope in London was that enough pirates would accept the pardon to reduce the need for long naval campaigns across scattered islands, while the remainder could be confronted with more concentrated effort once New Providence returned to formal administration. But preparing for the voyage to the Bahamas required more than diplomatic instructions. Rogers organized a small convoy that carried timber, iron fittings, gunpowder, canvas, and basic tools needed to repair the ruined fort at Nassau. These materials were essential because earlier conflict had damaged local defenses to a point where they could no longer offer any deterrent. The convoy also transported supplies for a garrison, medical equipment, and printed copies of the King's pardon. Surviving invoices from the expedition indicate careful accounting of things such as nails, hinges, spare sails, and rope. The total volume reflected the government's understanding that New Providence had fallen into a condition where even simple repairs would be difficult without imported materials. Rogers departed England in December 1717 and reached the Bahamas in the middle of the following year. As the convoy approached Nassau's inlet, those on board saw ruined fortification, damaged dwellings, and stretches of coastline that showed clear signs of long neglect. The few population remaining consisted of fishermen, a few farmers, and families who had stayed despite earlier conflict. Many dwellings near the shore had lost their roofs or inner walls, and debris from earlier raids remained visible in several places. The harbour itself was calm, but the settlement lacked the features associated with a functioning colonial port. On landing, Rogers announced the terms of the King's pardon. Men who wished to accept lined up to record their names, providing a starting point for re-establishing civil administration. Later depositions revealed that many of these men had served during the war, turned to piracy when employment disappeared, and now viewed the pardon as a practical means of returning to legal work. Some expressed hope of joining merchant vessels or finding labour in nearby colonies once their names were cleared. Others accepted because they feared that continued piracy would soon become untenable due to increasing patrol. But not all men reacted in the same way. A significant number rejected the pardon immediately. They doubted that officials in London would honour its terms, or believed that accepting it would expose them to unresolved disputes in other colonies. Others feared that lawful work would return them to low wages, irregular pay, and harsh treatment under naval officers. For these reasons, they prepared to leave the island before Rogers could establish control. Their decision marked the beginning of a division that would shape events across nearby waters for several months. As soon as the initial registrations were complete, Rogers began the work of restoring New Providence. He directed efforts to repair the fort overlooking the inlet, using timber carried by the convoy and stones recovered from damaged structures. The fort, though modest in size, held symbolic and practical importance. Its restoration signaled that arrival and departure would no longer occur without notice. Cannons placed at the entry point offered a basic deterrent to vessels attempting to anchor without approval. Rogers also re-established a local council to handle civilian matters and encouraged families who had left during previous conflict to return. He allocated land for small farms near the settlement and arranged for fishing equipment to be repaired using materials brought by the convoy. These efforts aimed to ensure that the island could support a civilian population, rather than rely entirely on supplies from nearby colonies. Letters sent by Rogers during this period describe shortages of food and building materials, but also record progress in clearing debris, repairing dwellings, and reopening paths used to bring produce from inland gardens to the harbour. Men who accepted the king's pardon played an important role in these early efforts. Some joined local defence units and assisted in monitoring nearby channels. Their knowledge of reefs, currents, and seasonal movement allowed Rogers to anticipate where pirates who refused the pardon might attempt to regroup. Others helped rebuild dwellings, repair fishing boats, or clear areas near the fort for storage of supplies. Their involvement provided labour that would have been difficult to obtain otherwise and helped integrate them into the daily life of the island. While Rogers was strengthening the settlement, the men who rejected the pardon attempted to continue piracy elsewhere. They soon found, though, that conditions had changed. Colonial officials across the region took notice of Rogers' arrival and increased efforts to monitor movement near the Bahamas. Correspondence between Jamaica, Bermuda, and mainland ports showed that information about sightings began to circulate more quickly than before. Letters that once took weeks to arrive now moved with greater pace due to improved relay points along major routes. This development reduced the chance that a pirate vessel could move unnoticed between colonies. This increased flow of information affected the ability of remaining pirates to use anchorages that had once provided temporary safety. Places where crews had collected water or repaired hulls came under closure notice. Governors instructed patrol vessels to examine inlets known to have supported piracy in earlier years. Some islands that had seen little oversight began receiving small detachments of men tasked with observing movement along nearby channels. Pirates who attempted to use these places for repairs now risked discovery by patrols that had not existed in previous years. The lack of secure anchorages had direct consequences. Pirate vessels still needed regular maintenance. Hulls had to be cleaned. Mast, yards, and rigging needed care to avoid failure during voyages. Without access to calm water and time to make repairs, vessels gradually lost speed and reliability. This decline made it increasingly difficult for pirates to intercept merchant ships, many of which now travelled in pairs or adjusted their routes to reduce the risk of piracy. Charles Vane offered the clearest example of these new challenges. His rejection of the pardon had been immediate. He left New Providence with men who remained loyal to him and moved forward towards the channels of North Cuba. For a brief period, he continued to seize small vessels that lacked the capacity to resist. However, as patrols increased and information circulated more quickly, each voyage became riskier. Captains in Jamaica and other colonies received guidance to avoid certain inlets until patrols reported them safe. This reduced the number of predictable targets available to Vane and his men. Internal tensions soon worsened Vane's situation. During one encounter, he sighted a large French vessel that some of his men believed could be taken. Vane assessed the risk as too high and ordered a retreat. His decision caused immediate disagreement. Several men viewed it as a failure of judgment, at a time when opportunities were already limited. Within days, they removed him from command and appointed John Rackham in his place. This event showed how authority aboard pirate vessels depended on confidence rather than formal rank. A single decision could shift the balance of support rapidly. But Rackham inherited a difficult situation. His vessel was small and required repairs that could not be carried out safely. His crew possessed limited supplies, and movement between regions was becoming harder due to increased patrol. Rackham attempted to continue piracy near the northern coast of the island that now forms part of Jamaica. Statements taken after his capture indicate persistent concerns about leaks, worn rigging, and reduced quantities of powder. These limitations affected the crew's capacity to engage in theft at sea. The presence of Anne Bonny and Mary Read aboard Rackham's vessel drew attention from colonial officials. Not only was their case unusual, both had initially concealed their genders to secure work on the pirate ships, only revealing the truth after years of intense service. But both were widely recognized and reported due to their hardened criminality on previous ventures. Captains that were victims of piracy did not easily forget a woman that held a weapon to his throat during a boarding. Multiple witnesses confirmed that both took part during raids and handled weapons during encounters. Their examinations in Port Royal provided some of the most detailed testimony available after the period. The increased visibility eventually ended Rackham's activity when a vessel under the authority of the Governor of Jamaica, commanded by Jonathan Barnett, located his sloop near the northern coast. Once his vessel was seized, the crew was taken to Port Royal under naval guard. There the proceedings moved quickly. Colonial officials viewed Rackham not as a figure of strategic importance, but as a man whose continued presence at sea posed a straightforward threat to local trade. His trial, held before the Admiralty Court, focused on testimony from captured sailors and from masters of vessels he had taken in the preceding months. The evidence confirmed that Rackham had directed raids in Jamaican waters despite earlier warnings issued by local authorities. When the court delivered its sentence, Rackham received the penalty fixed by law for piracy: death by hanging. The execution took place at Gallows Point, the site used for men convicted of serious maritime offences. Records indicate that the authorities intended the event to serve as a warning, and they followed the standard procedure of transporting the condemned man under guard to the shore before securing the noose and carrying out the sentence. After the execution, officials ordered his body to be placed in an iron gibbet and displayed on a small quay near Port Royal. This practice, used in several colonies, aimed to deter others by leaving the body exposed to the elements, suspended above the water where passing crews could see it clearly. Reports noted that Rackham's remains hung there for some time, visible to vessels entering and leaving the harbour. This display marked the end of his presence in the region and served as a physical reminder of the consequences faced by those who continued piracy after rejecting the king's pardon. While Rackham's career ended, another figure from early years played a different role. Benjamin Hornigold, who accepted the king's pardon, placed his knowledge of the region in service of the governor. He assisted in identifying likely paths taken by pirates who refused the pardon, and helped guide patrols to inlets that had previously offered refuge. His familiarity with shallow water routes, reefs, and seasonal patterns allowed Rogers to anticipate where remaining pirates might attempt to operate. Hornigold's involvement demonstrated how former pirates could contribute to efforts aimed at reducing piracy, once legal protection encouraged a change in direction. This era would see the death of the most famous pirate that ever lived, Blackbeard. In November 1718, Edward Teach anchored his sloop Adventure near Ocracoke Inlet on the North Carolina coast. This inlet provided calm water and a narrow approach that gave him warning of incoming ships. He had recently accepted, then violated, a royal pardon, which placed him in open conflict with colonial officials. When reports reached Virginia's governor, Alexander Spotswood, that Teach was operating again, he authorized an immediate strike. He dispatched 2 armed vessels under Lieutenant Robert Maynard to hunt him down, even though the action took place beyond Virginia's formal jurisdiction. Maynard reached Ocracoke before dawn on the 22nd of November. Blackbeard's lookout sighted the approaching boats, but the narrow channel prevented Maynard from bringing his ships alongside quickly. Teach responded by firing a broadside that tore into Maynard's sloop, killing several men outright and leaving the deck splattered with blood and splintered timber. The blast disabled much of Maynard's firepower, but the lieutenant pressed forward, ordering his surviving crew to lie flat so the deck appeared empty. Teach took the bait. Believing the English crew had been wiped out, he steered alongside, preparing to board and finish the job hand to hand. As Adventure's pirates leapt across the gap, Maynard shouted for his men to rise. Dozens surged upward from the deck, weapons in hand. The 2 groups collided in a violent melee. Pistols fired at close range, knives were driven into limbs, and men slammed one another against the rails. Teach fought in the center of the clash. Witnesses reported that he carried multiple pistols and swung his cutlass with enough force to hack through Maynard's sword, snapping it near the hilt. Maynard would later confirm this. Another officer stepped in with a blade and drove it deep into Teach's body. Despite several wounds, later counted as at least 5 gunshots and more than 20 cuts, Teach continued fighting until Maynard's men overwhelmed, driving him backward and cutting him down. When Teach finally collapsed, Maynard ordered his head removed. The crew severed it and hung it from the bowsprit of Maynard's sloop as proof of his death. Teach's decapitated body was thrown into the inlet, where it drifted briefly before sinking beneath the tide. The engagement ended the career of one of the most visible pirates in the Atlantic and signaled a turning point in the effort to remove piracy from the region. While these individual outcomes unfolded, New Providence continued to develop in ways that limited the possibility of renewed piracy. Merchants from nearby islands began to use the harbor with greater confidence. They recognized that the return of formal administration reduced uncertainty and made it easier to exchange goods across the region. The repaired fort provided defense against unapproved entry, and the presence of the garrison ensured that disputes were handled through recognized procedures rather than informal agreements among visiting crews. The island, once a gathering point for pirates, now functioned as a settlement connected through regular correspondence with nearby colonies. By the early 1720s, the features that had allowed piracy to flourish near New Providence were no longer in place. The island held a functioning government, a small but stable population, and oversight capable of monitoring arrivals and departures. Pirate crews who had refused the pardon struggled to find water, materials, and quiet inlets for repair. Their vessels deteriorated due to continued movement without maintenance. Patrols moved through channels that had once gone unobserved, and as a result, theft at sea became harder to sustain. These developments marked the end of a phase in which New Providence served as an unregulated center for piracy in the Bahamas. The next chapter would concern how the events of these years entered written accounts, influenced public memory, and shaped later understanding of piracy in the Atlantic world. With New Providence moving towards regular administration, attention turned gradually from immediate concerns on the island to the wider effects across nearby waters. The early signs of this shift appeared in letters exchanged between governors in Jamaica, Bermuda, and the mainland colonies. Earlier correspondence had arrived late due to uncertain relay points and regular schedules. Messages carried by vessels employed for local purposes moved slowly and often only arrived after the situation at sea had changed. By the late 1710s, the pattern changed. Local administration made greater use of small craft for dispatches, allowing information to circulate with more pace. The circulation of information limited the opportunity for remaining pirates to act without notice. Colonial merchants responded to these changes with adjustments of their own. In earlier years, they had relied on predictable routes that connected ports producing sugar, rice, tobacco, and timber. These routes had been efficient, but left vessels exposed to piracy when naval protection was limited. As order returned, merchants coordinated departure so that 2 or 3 vessels could travel within sight of each other. While such small convoys lacked the force of naval escorts, they offered limited security by reducing the likelihood that a pirate vessel could isolate a single target without being seen by the others. Captains also began to avoid certain passages during months when winds might push their vessels towards inlets commonly used by pirates. These adjustments, though minor, compared with later maritime practice, reflected the changing character of the region. For the remaining pirates, these developments reduced the number of predictable opportunities for theft. Many had relied on the seasonal movement of cargo that followed familiar paths across the Bahamas. When captains altered these paths, even slightly, it complicated the work of locating vessels. The success of piracy had always depended on proximity. A pirate vessel needed to be close enough to intercept a merchant ship without having to pursue it for long. When targets appeared less frequently, the risks increased, and each voyage required greater caution. The men who had rejected the king's pardon attempted to compensate by moving towards areas they believed remained less observed. Some travelled towards channels near the southern edge of Cuba. Others moved northward towards the regions that now form part of the southeastern coast of the United States. Yet these areas too saw changes. Local officials, following Rogers' arrival on New Providence, asked commanders of nearby vessels to make periodic passes along these routes. These patrols were not continuous, but they altered expectations for pirates who had earlier assumed that certain coasts would remain quiet for extended periods. Testimony taken from captured pirates during the final years of this period included several comments that highlight these difficulties. Some described how their vessels leaked during rain, how worn canvas failed to hold wind effectively, or how reduced powder supply limited their ability to secure compliance from targeted ships. Others spoke of the reduced availability of food, recounting days where crews relied on fish caught near sandbanks or on small quantities of grain taken from captured vessels. These pressures had always existed, yet they became more severe as safe anchorages disappeared. The decline of piracy did not occur at the same pace across all areas. Some parts of the Bahamas continued to see activity for a brief period after Rogers' arrival. Vessels travelling between Jamaica and Bermuda reported occasional sightings, yet even these reports became less frequent as the year wore on. Letters from Jamaica in 1719 noted fewer delays caused by piracy than in previous years. Insurance agents in London recorded gradual reductions in premiums for vessels crossing certain channels. These economic indicators reflected a broad change in conditions rather than isolated success. The changing environment influenced local administration as well. New Providence, once almost vacant, gradually took on the features of a functioning colony. Thus, trade began to move with greater predictability. Merchants from nearby islands used the harbour to exchange goods, confident that arriving vessels would be monitored. Local labourers sold produce and fish, providing income that had been absent during earlier years. These small economic interactions contributed to the island's integration with the wider region. They also provided the population necessary to support long-term administration, reducing dependence on supplies from other colonies. As piracy declined, some men who had earlier rejected the king's pardon attempted to move into legal work. This transition was not always simple. Local administrations judged each case individually, and many colonies required clear evidence that no outstanding disputes remained before permitting a return to lawful employment. Evidence from this period includes requests from former pirates seeking permission to work aboard merchant ships or to settle as labourers. Outcomes varied, reflecting differences in local practice and the extent to which authorities believed each man's account of the past. Among the few who retained visibility during the final years of this period, Blackbeard's death near Ocracoke remained notable. His blockade of Charleston had appeared in correspondence across the colony, and his name had been recorded repeatedly due to the scale of disruption he caused. When news of Blackbeard's death reached nearby colonies, the reaction revealed how deeply his presence had shaped local politics. Teach had operated near the border between Virginia and North Carolina, and the decision by Governor Alexander Spotswood of Virginia to send armed vessels beyond his own territory caused immediate disagreement. North Carolina's officials argued that the action had occurred without their consent, and they questioned whether a governor could authorize a pursuit in waters claimed by another colony. Letters exchanged in the months that followed recorded this dispute in plain terms. Virginia defended the operation as necessary, while North Carolina demanded an explanation for why its own authorities had not been consulted. Some officers in North Carolina had long been suspected of cooperating quietly with pirates, adding further tension to the exchange. As these disagreements unfolded, the crew taken from Teach's vessel faced proceedings in Virginia. The men were examined individually. Several gave accounts that differed in detail but revealed the difficulties of interpreting life aboard a pirate vessel. Some claimed they had been taken against their will during earlier encounters at sea. Others stated that they had joined voluntarily but had attempted to leave. One man, Samuel Odell, survived multiple wounds received during the fight at Ocracoke, including gunshots and cuts, yet recovered well enough to stand before the court. The verdicts varied. Some men were convicted and executed. Others were released after the court accepted their claims of coercion. These cases illustrated that even with the final phase of piracy, colonial courts still judged each man according to the evidence presented. In the days after Teach's death, officials searched his vessel for hidden cargo. They dismantled planking, examined compartments below deck, and questioned the surviving crew about any buried coin ashore. Teach's reputation had long included rumors of concealed wealth, yet these searches produced little beyond the goods already visible. The absence of significant treasure or valuable metal suggested that Teach had not maintained large reserves, and it reinforced the view among officials that most piracy relied on the rapid sale of captured goods rather than long-term storage. Teach's closest associates met different outcomes in the months that followed. Israel Hands, who served as Teach's boatswain and had been wounded earlier when Teach fired a pistol during a dispute, was not present at Ocracoke. He accepted the king's pardon soon after and travelled to England. Records indicate that he later faced charges for a minor offence in London before disappearing from the surviving documentation. Another associate, known as Caesar, was captured during the final operation and was executed accordingly. Other men who had sailed with Teach earlier in his career scattered across the region, some attempting to settle quietly in colonies where they were not known. Teach's death also provided material used by contemporary writers and officials seeking to influence public opinion. Printed accounts circulated in London, describing the engagement and emphasizing the removal of a figure who had gained notice across the Atlantic. Engravings depicted the final encounter, often with details that did not appear in official reports. Governors used the event in the correspondence to argue for continued funding of patrol vessels and for measures that would limit further piracy. In this way, Teach's death became part of a wider effort to present piracy as a threat that can be controlled through coordinated action. With Teach gone, the informal networks that had connected smaller pirate groups weakened. Several men who had depended on his knowledge of local waters attempted to continue piracy, yet they lacked the organization that had allowed Teach to coordinate movement near channels between the mainland and the Bahamas. Some sailed south towards waters near Cuba, while others attempted to find new crews near islands once served as temporary anchorages. Their efforts produced little lasting effect. Without secure places to repair vessels or steady information about merchant schedules, they faced conditions that made continued activity difficult. Teach's death therefore marked more than the end of an individual career. It signalled a turning point in the region, one shaped by political disagreement, legal proceedings, failed searches for hidden cargo, and the dissolution of networks that had supported piracy during earlier years. The combination of these elements, together with the administrative changes already underway across the Bahamas, contributed to a conclusion of a brief but influential period in Atlantic history. Thanks for listening to Sleep with History. There are many more adventures awaiting if you aren't asleep already. Please consider subscribing, liking, or joining me on Patreon for just £3 a month to help keep these videos ad-free. Thank you, and good night.